Right. Thanks very much. Our next speaker is a man I've known for many years, but who comes with a considerable public following in one form or another, Lowell Bergman. And please come up. And the Lowell is well known to many of you because he was one of the few journalists, I think, who's ever been played by a major movie star, Al Pacino, in The Insider. And I won't say much more because Lowell has been with 60 Minutes a long time, which that film documents, and before that was a long journalist with a long and distinguished history in alternative journalism in the States. Lowell.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I thought I was going to talk mostly about multinational corporations this afternoon, but I'm going to add a couple of remarks in here and shorten the other end of it because of what I've been observing here over the last day and a half and listening to. But before I get into that, I wanted to tell you that I am the David and Reva Logan Professor of, now they call me the Distinguished Chair, that is, I'm a piece of furniture, at the University of California in Berkeley at the Graduate School of Journalism, where we have an investigative reporting program. That all came about, the symposium we have there, which is now going to have its 9th session next April, annual symposium on investigative reporting, to which I invite you all. And this conference, which is an extension in some ways of Richard Cumming and Gavin Cumming over the years, is all due to David Logan, who has passed away, but who was an extraordinary human being who, when I first met him, and because he had expressed an interest in supporting investigative reporting, and I sat down and asked him at lunch, why do you want to do this? Why are you interested in it? And he says, I like to make trouble. So I think you're all succeeding and living up to his expectations. That said, I also want to say a couple of things. Having come out of the alternative press, having come out of the civil rights movement, out of the anti-war movement, and magazines like Ramparts, which some of you may have heard of, having worked my way into the establishment press and gone through ABC News, 60 Minutes, the New York Times, and now doing projects with my students and postgraduate fellows for a variety of outlets, including PBS Frontline. I wanted to pass on a couple of lessons because I think that are useful from what I've been hearing and what in our day and sometimes today we call advocacy journalism. Here's a couple of lessons I've learned, and I hope that you take them with you. One is, always report against your story. Make sure that you check your story out completely. If you want to know why some stories that may turn out to be true don't get picked up, it's because someone hasn't done the due diligence to prove to skeptics that it's in fact substantial. The other is that documents are always the best thing to get. But remember, all of us in the business have made the mistake of not checking out our documents. Documents can lie. And third, and you heard this, I think, from Nikki before and others, face-to-face is always best when you're trying to do reporting and develop sources. In the day of the internet and digital communications, where it's obviously much easier than it was in our time to communicate with people, it's so much easier to stay behind your desk, not get up and meet people face to face. That's how you get them to trust you, but it's also how you get them to talk. It's a lot. The only person I've ever seen or observed be able to use a telephone in a way that got someone to talk to them, even though they didn't want to or shouldn't, was Cy Hirsch. But he has this, as if you met him the other day, he has this unusual personality and ability to make people talk over the phone. It's almost like he grabs them across the wires and strangles them until they talk. But for most of us, it's human persuasion. So those are the three things that I wanted you to come away from if we hadn't heard it before. And then one other thing, which is that about sources and whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are sources, but not all sources are whistleblowers. And the sources we get in the business are not necessarily the people that we're going to like or want to meet or spend time with. They're the people who have the information that we want and need. And we need to look at it that way if you want those people to cooperate with you and talk to you. And often, my best sources became people initially who, for example, were my enemies. If you were to look at my FBI file, which, by the way, you can get in the United States, you can get your own personal FBI file under Freedom of Information, you would see that some of the agencies that were tracking me 40 years ago, 45 years ago, I've now developed as sources, people inside those agencies. You wouldn't expect that I would want to go meet and spend time with them. Initially, I didn't, but I did, and it's helped a lot in my reporting career. So remember, whistleblowers, and whistleblowers aren't necessarily good sources. They don't necessarily always have, no matter how much you may sympathize with where they're coming from or their reasons, you need to check out their information as well. Okay, class, that's the lesson. The other, to catch up, before I came from California, I called up my friend Jim Risen. You probably all know about Jim Risen. He's the person who broke the NSA eavesdropping story, which ran in 2005. You may know that the story was held for a year by the New York Times. They didn't think it was ready. But because Jim threatened to, well, was going to publish the story in a book, they decided to publish it in the New York Times. Jim is now facing possible jail. And the update on his situation is that Eric Holder, who is still Attorney General, according to Jim, currently has a new subpoena for him on his desk. The prosecutors in the case are intent on going forward. The trial in which he's supposed to testify, or they're going to try to get him to testify, is scheduled to begin in January. So that situation will play itself out over the next few months. But Jim is still resolute. But he and I were having a conversation, and when I was hearing the discussion today about sources and documents, and this is one area I'm going to get into. National security reporting rarely has documents. As it was said before, you rarely see a document dump like Chelsea Manning. You rarely see anything like Snowden's never happened before, or Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. And in Jim's case, for the original NSA eavesdropping story, he told me, no documents. It was all sources. And all the source meetings that he had took place in ways in which, despite a massive government investigation looking for the leaks, they haven't been found. Okay. Now, I wanted to differentiate between, because there's been a lot of discussion, obviously, of national security reporting. National security reporting and reporting on the government is different than reporting on private power. The difference primarily is that the people who have private power, who have unaccountable wealth, who are not accountable to anyone but themselves, basically, and have the power to retaliate for stories in ways other than the government, those stories are, in fact, in my opinion, much more difficult to do, particularly in the United States. And the reason is that the people who have that power can retaliate, can scare your bosses, can cause them not to run a story. Or as in the case that Chuck alluded to, which became the movie The Insider, at 60 Minutes, I discovered that while I was developing my source, Jeffrey Wigand, and trying to get him to go on camera, a number of things happened in the course of trying to do that story. Number one, I found out the same day that I met Jeffrey Wigand, I met a man in Louisville, Kentucky, who just passed away, Merrill Williams, who was a paralegal at a law firm in Louisville, Kentucky, who had stolen 5,000 documents from a law firm that represented Brown and Williamson Tobacco. Now, to give you an idea of what the situation was back then in 1993-94, this was February of 1994, CBS News had just lost the largest libel judgment in the history of the United States to Brown and Williamson Tobacco in Chicago, Illinois, for a local opinion person who appeared on their local news, equating their advertising to children with Goebbels and the Nazis. They sued, they won, and it was upheld on appeal, and they paid the $3 million. So in early 1994, I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, because I'd seen an AP wire story that said that a paralegal had stolen documents from a law firm representing Brown and Williamson, and that a judge had ordered him, and that he in turn was being sued by the law firm after he attempted to extort money from them in exchange for returning the documents. And a judge had ordered that he was not allowed to tell his attorney what was in the documents. That I was already trying to make contact with someone whose name I had, Jeffrey Wigand, and get him to talk to me. So when I realized I had two people possibly to see in Louisville, I living in Berkeley, California, I decided that it was worth my going 3/4 way across the country to knock on their doors, basically, to go see them. In Wigand's case, what I did before I left, and this is the other technique if you want to make sure that you've made contact with someone, call them late at night at home, because he wasn't responding. And I just said, meet me at 11 o'clock in the morning, 2 days from that phone call at the Seelbach Hotel in downtown Louisville. And then I arranged to meet through this attorney, his client, Merrill Williams. I went to see Williams first. And in that meeting, it turned out he didn't really know anything, other than these documents were probably valuable to the tobacco company. But when I sat there, he told me that he had sent a set of the documents to a former reporter for the Washington Post and to Ralph Nader's organization. So I thought, well, that story's going to be gone before I can ever get it on 60 Minutes. So I proceeded to my 11 o'clock meeting and met with Wigand. Now, it took from that meeting with Wigand until he finally sat down before a camera, a year and a half. A year and a half of going back and talking with him, a year and a half of persuading him to try and go on camera and tell his story. It was sort of the development of a whistleblower as opposed to a source. But what I learned at the end of that process was that money can speak louder than the news inside a news organization. What I learned was that Jeffrey, and this is actually not in the movie, that Jeffrey Wigand was going to be the star witness in a federal grand jury that was going to examine perjury charges against the 8 presidents of the major tobacco companies in the United States, one of whom he worked for and one of whom he had had conversations with that contradicted the testimony of the president of that company to Congress. The person who was the president of that company, Lorillard Tobacco, was the son of Larry Tisch, who owned CBS. So I was in a situation, an unusual situation, where my source, my star witness, my main actor in my story, was also going to be a witness in a criminal case against the owner of the company, who at that time was trying to sell it to Westinghouse, and the story itself might have disrupted that deal. So, as Chuck mentioned, that was one of a number of stories at 60 Minutes that got spiked. The difference in that situation, and just to give you my general reflection on what happened, is that until the president of CBS News told me that the corporation would not risk its assets on this story, I operated as any journalist would operate. But at the moment where the company decided to abandon someone who was our source, a man who the executives were on top of me for a long time, when is that guy ever going to talk? When that happened, the rules changed. So if you do ever find yourself in that kind of situation I would say you have no other choice, and the company has told you that it's not going to operate under the same principles that they say they operate in, as news organizations, then I don't think you have any other choice than to do whatever you can to protect your source and to get your story out. I was lucky. The story did get out for various reasons. Some of the things that we did and that later came out worked in terms of embarrassing CBS and eventually getting them to do the story, but only after, unfortunately for me, the basic documents that Wigand had went to the Wall Street Journal, and they published them and would later go and win the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting on a story we could have run, and eventually did, but much later. Okay. Now, we also have been listening to the, knowing about Jim Risen and knowing about the administration and what the administration has been up with hunting our sources. We've had a focus on the disappointment we all have with the Obama and Holder administrations in the Justice Department when it comes to going after us or going after our sources. The other very remarkable thing about this Justice Department is that it has been the friendliest to corporate America of almost any Justice Department since I started out in the news business 45 years ago. Even the Bush, Ashcroft, Gonzalez Justice Departments, which you would expect would be soft on corporations and corporate crime, have put more senior executives of major corporations in jail than this administration in the last 7 years. In fact, they haven't put any in jail. So we have an anomalous situation in the US where the administration, which appears to be friendlier to the press when you listen to what they say, that they do the opposite when it comes to what they actually do. And in that, the ramifications of them continuing the policies of the Bush administration when it comes to law enforcement in terms of corporate crime has had a great impact, I think, on reporting on multinational corporations and people with unaccountable wealth and power. And the result of that is what you see in the Justice Department today is that, for example, they used to have a very prestigious section called the Organized Crime and Racketeering section, made famous by Robert Kennedy, and also over a period of about 20 or 30 years, going after major organized crime groups. People haven't noticed that its name has changed. It's the Organized Crime and Gangs section, and it's going after street gangs. And veteran prosecutors in the Justice Department who are involved in those kinds of cases, and that's what they wanted to do, which would be complex, both corporate and organized criminal investigations, are leaving. They're leaving because they're not making those cases. What does that mean to us as reporters? It means that the political climate is such, in terms of law enforcement, that they are not, in some ways, the allies we once had. Allies both as sources, but also people who might follow up on the stories that we do. And that's historically, that's been a very important factor in the United States, at least, to the growth of investigative reporting. If you want to get nostalgic, our forebears in the world of investigative reporting, the muckrakers of 100 years ago, enjoyed the enthusiastic backing of the man who gave him that name, Theodore Roosevelt. And one of those muckrakers, Ray Stannard Baker, had the experience of going into the White House and meeting with Theodore Roosevelt personally and being given a letter that said, "To whom it may concern in the government, please give this man every courtesy that he deserves, including your cooperation and any information he asks for." I'm waiting for President Obama to invite us in and give us similar treatment. And the other thing that I did want to refer to as some context is that when we're talking about eavesdropping and electronic eavesdropping, like many other stories, it's not new. none of us are old enough to remember that in the well, maybe there's some people here, in the late 1930s, that the Supreme Court of the United States was bugged by corporate America. It was discovered, the microphones were discovered, they never fully identified the people who installed them, but it had to do with arguments in a corporate case. And they wanted to hear what the deliberations were inside the Supreme Court's conference rooms. In fact, what was going on in the United States in the 20s and 30s, 40s and 50s, up through the 60s, was an epidemic, as it was been called, of eavesdropping. In 1955, the newspapers revealed that the police had raided an apartment on West 55th Street in Manhattan, where private investigators had set up a set of switchboards and had bribed people at AT&T to put in trunk lines to the switchboards and were selling the service of listening to your competitors' phones at different companies from that apartment complex. That story, by the way, for those of you who are interested and others about the epidemic, hasn't really been the subject of any reporting or books recently, but in 1958, a man named Sam Dash wrote a book called The Eavesdroppers. And Dash went on to become famous as the general counsel of the Watergate Committee, an expert on wiretapping, eavesdropping, and its practice. So let me tell you that in my recent work that I've been doing a long-term project with Frontline, and what I'm doing now, which is a report on the Chinese gambling capital of Macau and the involvement of U.S. gaming companies there. Many of you may not know that it's 7 times bigger than Las Vegas. It's the largest gaming venue in the world, and it's the place where Sheldon Adelson, Steve Wynn, and others have become super rich. In the course of doing this reporting, I've developed a number of sources, and this relates to eavesdropping. And one of those sources 3 months ago, in the way that we communicate, because I can't see him face to face most of the time, said to me, "Your phones are covered." This is an executive inside one of those companies with access to that kind of information. He said that your email was covered. And I came away from that conversation knowing that we had spent years working on this with very little in the way of encryption for our general files, et cetera, and that we were potentially very exposed. But then I realized that that might also just be a warning, because we've had 2 burglaries, one of our offices at the university and one at my home. Nothing has been taken. Certain wires were cut and other things were revealed that were obviously done to let us know that they're watching. You may have to watch Frontline to find out who's doing this. We hope to be on the air in the next couple of months. So let me just make one other remark in one other area of difference. And this has to do with protecting the discussion that we've had about protecting sources. One of the other big problems that I've run into since the Obama administration took office and this Justice Department began running things is that people are afraid to talk in private industry because they're going to get sued. We as journalists can't help them if there are sources or even if they appear in our programs. We can if there's a libel suit and the insurance company will go along with it. If you have an insurance company, they can be included in our joint defense. But that's it. We have no other way of saving them from being sued in every state or in any country by people with those kinds of assets. And working on that problem and how to provide some third-party assistance to people who are confidential sources or people who want to come forward and speak is something that I think we at the program in Berkeley will be heavily involved in the years to come. Thank you, and I look forward to the next speaker.